Victor Langston was the kind of man whose wealth walked into a room long before he did. Polished shoes, tailored suits, diamond cufflinks, all carefully chosen to reinforce a hierarchy he never questioned. To him, life had always been about climbing ladders others built, then kicking them away once he reached the top. Born into privilege and raised on the belief that money equaled merit, Victor developed a sharp intellect but an even sharper arrogance. He was respected in the boardroom, feared in negotiations, and quietly disliked by those forced to orbit around his ego. In his towering Manhattan penthouse, Victor frequently hosted elite gatherings where status was currency and humiliation was often served alongside champagne. He enjoyed testing others, not out of curiosity but dominance. If someone failed to answer a historical reference or stumbled on a quote in Latin, he'd smirk as though it confirmed his long-standing theory. Some people were simply born beneath others. On one such evening, Elena, a maid newly hired through a domestic staffing agency, moved through the shadows of the celebration, unnoticed. She was in her late 20s, neatly dressed in a uniform far too large for her frame, hair tied in a modest bun, posture impeccable. No one paid her attention, not out of rudeness necessarily, but because she was considered part of the furniture. She poured wine, cleared glasses, straightened napkins, all without interrupting the rhythm of elite conversation. Victor noticed her during one of his storytelling tirades, in which he often painted himself as a savior of the intellectually deprived. That night he was reciting lines from obscure 18th-century French philosophers, tossing around names like Rousseau and Diderot with theatrical flair. His audience, executives and investors alike, nodded obligingly, though most had no idea what he was saying. That was the point. As Elena passed by with an empty tray, he paused mid-sentence. Something in her composure, too graceful, too assured. For a maid, irritated him. She didn't look intimidated. She looked aware. Curious, even. Hey, Victor called out, holding a small antique book he'd grabbed from his shelf, a collection of French essays from Pascal. Come here. She hesitated but walked over, expression unreadable. Victor flipped the book, open to a particularly dense passage. He read it aloud in heavily accented French, his pronunciation sharp but mechanical. Then he grinned. Translate this, he said loud enough for the room to hear. Do it perfectly and my fortune is yours? Laughter rippled around them, not malicious, but dismissive. The idea that a maid could parse philosophical French was, to them, absurd. That was the joke. Elena looked at the page calmly. She didn't flinch. She didn't stammer or smile nervously. She read the entire passage in her own voice, first in French, each word clear and fluid, then in English, translating not just the words but the tone, the nuance, the philosophical depth behind the sentence. She even added a brief comment about the context of the quote within Pascal's broader work, mentioning how it reflected his obsession with the conflict between reason and faith. The room fell silent. Not out of shock alone, but out of embarrassment. Victor, stunned, blinked several times, then tried to recover. You've studied this? I studied French literature and philosophy, she said, voice soft but firm. At the Sorbonne? I graduated with distinction. Murmurs echoed across the room. The Sorbonne, the name alone spoke volumes. It was one of the most prestigious universities in Europe, the kind of place Victor would brag about visiting, not attending, he stammered, trying to frame the moment as a joke that had just gone well. Impressive, really impressive. But the truth was more uncomfortable. Victor's entire identity had been built on the assumption that people like Elena, maids, cleaners, the invisible class, lacked the sophistication, the intelligence, the right background. Her presence in that moment challenged not just his expectations, but the very framework he used to divide people into categories of worth. What Victor didn't realize was that Elena had once been in a different world entirely. Her father, a literature professor, had raised her among books and ideas. But when he passed away suddenly, debts buried the family, and her mother fell ill. Despite her degrees, she struggled to find work that paid the bills. a friend told her. That housekeeping, though beneath her skills, offered flexible hours and decent wages. She took the job not out of shame, but necessity. And so here she was, dusting books she had likely read more thoroughly than their owner, folding napkins, with the same hands that had once written theses on existentialism and postmodernism. Her hidden talent wasn't just her education, it was her ability to hold that knowledge quietly, with dignity, even while being underestimated. That moment between Victor and Elena wasn't just about a translation. It was about how society misjudges value, how intellect, worth, and grace are so often assumed to belong to those with power, while those who clean their floors and serve their wine are expected to remain voiceless. Elena's reply didn't just silence the room. It exposed the fragility of Victor's self-image. He had built his superiority on assumptions, and those assumptions crumbled with just one sentence from a woman he thought invisible. Victor Langston had always believed that power was measured by control, and nothing proved that more than having the last word. In his world, intellect was a weapon, and he wielded it as effortlessly as he wore his custom suits. At his social gatherings, he didn't just entertain, he tested people. His favorite method of asserting dominance wasn't loud or aggressive. It was subtle. He'd pose obscure questions, quote philosophers in dead languages, or drop foreign proverbs without translation. When people nodded along or stumbled through vague replies, he'd smirk. That smirk was his signature proof that he had cornered someone into inferiority. It wasn't about knowledge. It was about proving you didn't have it. During one of his high-profile evenings, guests flowed through his penthouse, sipping rare wines, laughing too politely, and pretending to understand his latest musings on comparative theology. Elena, a young housemaid, moved in the background, her black uniform blending into the shadows. She carried herself with quiet efficiency, her hands careful and steady, her face unreadable. Victor barely noticed her until he caught her glancing, not at him, but at the bookcase behind him, her eyes lingering on a particular row of texts in French. It was a flicker of curiosity, so quick and subtle that anyone else would have missed it. But Victor noticed everything, especially when it hinted at someone playing outside their role. That single glance irritated him. In his mind, a maid's place was to serve, not to scan literature. The idea that she might be familiar with the works behind the glass made him uneasy. So he did what he always did when faced with the unexpected. He tried to put her in her place, with a wine glass in one hand, and the other resting arrogantly on the bookshelf. Victor called her over. His voice was calm, but there was a gleam of condescension in his eyes. He pulled out a slim, antique book written entirely in French. The gold leaf on the cover was faded, the corners worn. It was a collection of essays by Pascal Dense, theological, abstract. Not the kind of text one would expect a domestic worker to even recognize, let alone interpret. Victor flipped to a random page and read a short passage aloud, his pronunciation rough but passable. Then he leaned back slightly and said the words he thought would amuse his audience and embarrass her at once. Translate this, and my fortune is yours. There was a moment of silence. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind people make when they know the punchline is someone else's humiliation. But Elena didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. She walked over, looked at the page for a brief moment, and then began to speak. Her voice was clear, gentle, and absolutely confident. First, she repeated the passage in perfect French fluid, without hesitation. Then, without pause, she translated into English. Not just word for word, but in tone, in meaning, in essence. She understood the text not as someone who had memorized it, but as someone who had lived in it, who had studied not only its grammar, but its soul. The smirks vanished. Victor froze. Her final sentence included a minor correction, noting that the quote Victor had read aloud was actually an abridged version often misattributed in modern compilations. She delivered the fact with grace, not arrogance. But to Victor it was a blade. Not because she had embarrassed him publicly, but because she had done so effortlessly, without even trying. In that moment, The irony turned sharp and unmistakable. Victor had meant to mock her. He had set up a trap designed to highlight her ignorance. Instead, he had walked into his own. The very test he created to assert superiority had become the moment he lost control. He couldn't laugh it off, nor could he patronize her reply. Her intelligence was undeniable. Her poise uncheckable. What made the moment even more powerful was that Elena didn't gloat. She didn't ask for the fortune he'd jokingly promised. She didn't say another word. She simply nodded, placed the book gently back on the table, and returned to her duties as though nothing had happened. That silence, that refusal to revel in his defeat, was what truly silenced the room. The irony. Cut deep because the exchange wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, precise, and undeniable. Victor, the man who prided himself on knowing more than anyone in the room, had misjudged her entirely. He had assumed that uniforms equaled ignorance, that wealth meant wisdom, and that people like Elena existed only in the margins of his story. But she flipped that script with a single sentence. Her knowledge, hidden beneath layers of expectation and invisibility, emerged not as a surprise, but as a correction to his worldview. That instant shift from mockery to admiration, from superiority to humility, wasn't just a twist in the conversation. It was a dismantling of everything Victor thought made him powerful. He had crafted a game to prove others' limits and instead found himself outplayed, not by a rival, but by someone he didn't even consider a player, and she had done it without raising her voice.